Hi, my name is Whitney. I'm so grateful to be joining you as you move through this series on trauma-informed advocacy as prepared by the Campaign for Trauma-Informed Policy and Practice, which you will hear me refer to as CTIP from this point forward. Before we dive in, we want to anchor in some predictions, acknowledgments, and disclaimers about the content that will be in this series. First, we understand that everyone is arriving in this space from a different place, and we invite you to choose what you do and do not watch based on what feels most relevant, useful, and meaningful to you. We also want to acknowledge that there's no one-size-fits-all way to approach advocacy, and we invite you to consider this series to be a generalized guide rather than an authoritative source. There are a lot of different ways to do things, and we'll be talking about concepts based on the best evidence that we could retrieve, as well as our lessons learned in this journey in realizing our own advocacy goals. We'll focus a lot on certain approaches, and we also hope to uplift different advocacy avenues you may find fit for you, including those that take place outside of your elected officials' offices. We want to support you based on what you need and intend this to be an ongoing process where we'll continually strive to strengthen the presentation of this content and also to be inclusive of other topics that advocates, from the seasoned leaders to those just beginning this work, would find useful. We welcome you to reach out to us and let us know what you'd like to see added to the series using a form you can find on our website. We also think it's important to mention that, as you notice various quotes interwoven throughout this series, please know that we're not necessarily endorsing the person quoted or their actions, but instead just intend to help create connection to and energy around the themes of the content we explore. Finally, we also want to let you know upfront that throughout this workshop series, we'll be discussing themes and content related to sensitive topics, including making comment to experiences related to trauma and adversity at the individual, family, community, institutional, and systemic levels. We acknowledge that these discussions may elicit feelings of discomfort for some members of our audience, and we invite and encourage each of you to tap into your expertise of yourself, to take steps to take care of yourself in whatever way makes sense for you as you move through the modules in this series. By the end of this module, it's our best hope that you feel equipped with the knowledge and tools needed to define and describe advocacy, with a particular emphasis on policy advocacy and the many different ways that that can look. We also hope that you emerge with an understanding of some of the more common enabling factors and reported barriers to advocacy, and that you're able to reflect and consider what resonates with you and what seems like a good fit for you in terms of some possible advocacy activities. So let's get into it. Starting with what advocacy actually is. Advocacy is a concept and definition that has evolved over time, and there are many different definitions out there. For the specific purposes of this series, we'll be looking at advocacy as any activity related to securing, defending, and championing the rights of individuals, groups, or communities using direct action, empowerment, or other means with the intention to advance meaningful change. At its core, advocacy is speaking on behalf of oneself or others to bring pressure to bear in ways that can make some change, generally to a policy, position, program, or institution. Advocacy takes place for a lot of different reasons, from groups seeking equal rights to furthering social justice, to raising public recognition of an issue, to securing a more equitable distribution of resources, to a whole host of other possibilities. On this slide, you'll see some of the more specific breakdowns of different types of policy, and I'd like to take a moment to just move through these to anchor us all in a common understanding and language, since these terms may be something you hear throughout. Our perspectives and experiences are powerful tools to promote positive change, and it's also true that when we understand public policy and advocacy, we're better prepared to make change happen. So these foundational details hopefully help to support the greater work that you'll be doing. Policies, at their core, are rules and principles that tell us which actions, among a multitude of actions, that we may and may not take. Policies guide the activities of government, businesses, institutions, and citizens. The essential function of a policy is to provide what is ideally a coherent and consistent response to a particular phenomena. And a policy can originate from many different places: enacted legislation, executive orders, judiciary interpretations, administrative decisions and actions, procedures, incentives, and many other sources. Public policy describes institutionalized proposals concerning a given topic endorsed and disseminated by a governmental entity or its representatives. It helps to know that public policy has changed in a few principal ways, including through legislation, regulatory measures, administrative rulemaking, executive orders, and litigation. Social policy is what we're mostly going to be thinking about for the purposes of this series. And social policy is a form of public policy related to what, how, and to whom opportunities and resources are made available and distributed so people may lead fruitful and fulfilling lives. Social policies seek to support well-being across the life course while reducing inequities through numerous dimensions in terms of governing things, ranging from how taxes are levied to which social programs exist and who does and doesn't qualify for a given program, to how the educational system is structured, and more. Next is policy advocacy, which is not the only type of advocacy, but most of what we'll be discussing in this series relates to policy advocacy. This is really about influencing the willingness of policy and decision makers to modify the conditions of society that seriously threaten the well-being of citizens or prevent them from developing their full potential. A policy measure is a legislative vehicle, generally a bill or resolution, which we'll get much more granular about later in this series. And a policy tool, or sometimes instrument, may be used interchangeably. That is a method through which governments seek to achieve a policy goal. This is really the linkage between policy formulation and policy implementation. And some common and routinely used policy instruments include providing grants, guarantees, and/or other means of funding sources or taxes, regulations, subsidies, incentives, public disclosure, and so on. And with that common understanding established, this slide depicts some ways to advocate. And these are not exhaustive examples, but there are some relevant activities and ideas that you might find engaging or worthwhile related to the work of CTIP. Advocacy at its broadest can include activities like public education, regulatory work, engaging with the media, litigation, work before administrative bodies, lobbying, voter registration and education, public demonstrations, and more ways of creating influence to further the cause. And while most of these activities take place outside of the meetings that happen in legislators' offices, they can all contribute to getting legislation passed. And often further advocacy, like what you see on this slide, is necessary. Sometimes making new laws is just the first step in transformative change, since there's work to be done related to whatever agency or entity is designated to effectuate the law and how they actually implement the new rules and regulations. Based on those broad definitions you heard, as well as the activities on the prior slide, consider: have you ever engaged in advocacy before, even on a small scale? Did you notice anything on that slide that struck you as something you might like to participate in yourself? And even beyond the type of advocacy, we're wondering what you think could be some compelling reasons to engage in policy advocacy in the first place, or maybe even some reasons you think it's not a good fit for you or someone else. This slide captures some reasons that often show up in the research, as well as some feedback we've heard from folks who participate in our advocacy activities, beginning with the power of relationship and connection with others, sharing certain values and priorities in doing this work. Advocacy is also powerful and an important catalyst for the change we want to see. A driving factor could also be a deep belief in the importance of creating change through determined, focused, and resolute action. Many, if not most, advocates report gaining a deeper sense of meaning through working toward the world they want to see. Sometimes what we've experienced ourselves or have witnessed others experiencing really helps us to see and want to be a part of the change necessary to attend to those experiences. Some may come to this work because they find satisfaction in being a part of something larger than them and important to their community, and it's important to their community as well as the broader world. And others yet may see great appeal in being able to integrate their own expertise, experiences, and skills into discussions and action to spur a systemic shift in how certain issues related to well-being are addressed. And many also find advocacy activities to be important venues for individuals, organizations, and groups, including those who historically may have been excluded from critical conversations, to actively and meaningfully participate in individual and collective advancing systems change. There are other reasons to advocate that you may have come up with too. These are only a few examples. One thing we can say definitively is that policy and advocacy are critical tools to bolster resilience, as policy and policymaking permeates and shapes our daily lives in countless ways and provides a potent vehicle for the equitable betterment of our society. So that's some key ways that people may want to get involved in the first place. Let's now take a look at some of the reasons that we know keeps people involved in advocacy. That could include feeling listened to and as if their ideas are supported or respected, when people see their impact really making a difference, when people perceive that their participation is appreciated and acknowledged, such as being recognized at a group meeting for a recent achievement that helped move the policy agenda forward. People also tend to stay involved when their unique strengths are tapped into, while difference and diversity are respected and embraced, when they are compensated for their time, expertise, and expenses incurred, which I concede may not always be possible across the board, but that does remain a powerful factor. And when they can have clear expectations that are transparently communicated, describing how their input fits in, that feels great too. Finally, during that reflection point, you may have also held in your mind some barriers to participating in advocacy activities. Some common ones, according to the research, as well as our experience at CTIP, include a felt lack of competence or confidence in their abilities or knowledge or speaking skills, to an understanding of policy creation that is a little bit lacking. People may fear that they will not know as much about their issue as their elected official would expect them to know, or perhaps that they won't know anything about how to answer questions that are asked of them. People may also feel that they lack the power to influence anyone. You may have heard people say that they believe that their representatives don't even care what they have to say, or that no one ever listens to their views. There was a survey conducted in 2016 that actually identified that 79% of participants believe that members of Congress listen to their party leaders instead of constituent concerns. That's a pretty pervasive message that has undoubtedly been reinforced by many external forces and sources, which makes sharing constituent success stories of driving effective influence and action even more important. In terms of powerlessness, it's also significant to recognize that for some, there is a perceived or real social or other cost associated with raising their voice that those perhaps with more privilege don't have to consider. And we've seen some of this emerge in the last couple of years, especially in the differential treatment of participants of certain advocacy activities like protests, depending on demographics and other factors. There's also the aspect that, especially if you're newer to advocacy, it can absolutely be tough to figure out where to start. There also are only so many hours in a day, and because time is finite, it can be really daunting to consider how to include advocacy in a balanced life. I also want to lift up that some people truly don't have the luxury of time, and this connects also to the last slide's note on compensating folks. People with lived experience whose voices are essential to trauma-informed advocacy may be excluded from participation because of the very inequities and disparities that we're trying to address, such as having to work multiple jobs to survive, along with riding unreliable public transit both ways, and having to pick up from school and care from children, and other such activities. Some people just do not have the luxury of providing a large amount of labor and time without compensation because it is already such a scarce resource. There's also the fact that some people are just ambivalent about government affairs, social issues, public policy, those sorts of things. And while others may dislike the general political climate that they perceive as rooted in animosity and conflict, some folks also may not necessarily draw connections between policy and their everyday lives, and therefore just don't even feel any sense of urgency around making sweeping systemic changes through policy. It's also important to note that there may be good reasons that folks harbor a healthy distrust in our larger systems and institutions, oftentimes related to harms that such systems and institutions have inflicted and are continuing to inflict. It makes sense that such experiences could breed skepticism and deter entry into advocacy. Some other folks are focused on making change in other ways, and they may not see themselves fitting into the advocacy process in a tangible way. And finally, one thing we at CTIP have heard time and time again, even from really dedicated advocates, is that there can be a perceived lack of alignment, support, or solidarity. Folks can feel, as is shown in this slide, like they are on an island. And because institutional and structural change is just too great a task for any single person to take on, people who don't feel connected to a network of like-minded advocates who share values and vision related to mutual hoped-for preferred futures, they may get deterred from engaging robustly in advocacy. So I took some time and did some digging here because it's really important to realize that all of the things on this slide absolutely makes sense. These are understandable perspectives, and that's really the essence of what makes this series important to us at CTIP. It's our best hope that this series addresses some of those perceived and actual barriers to participation that you see on the slide by demystifying some aspects of advocacy and the policy process, as well as by providing ideas, support, and strategies for how to use that information in advocacy activities so anyone watching this series can emerge with even one next small step on advancing advocacy around trauma-informed, resilience-building, and healing-centered policies and practices. And before concluding the content portion of this introductory module, we do want to take a moment to talk at a very high level about some important nuances about lobbying. All lobbying is advocacy, but not all advocacy is lobbying. And it's not uncommon for us to run into advocates who really want to be a part of this, but they feel that they can't because of 501c3 status. Fear of violating lobbying restrictions absolutely can limit meaningful activities and stifle important voices from being heard. So I just want to share a little bit about what's okay and what's not okay in terms of education and advocacy activities if you represent an entity with related restrictions. So without getting too into the weeds here, when we talk about lobbying, we're looking at attempts to influence government decision-making done in a capacity other than you as a private citizen, which actually doesn't have these restrictions. So you representing or conducting outreach on behalf of, for instance, a 501c3 for which you work, that's what we're focusing on. Note that I am not a lawyer, and this isn't legal advice, and there are some wonderful resources that I extracted this information from, including a really great in-depth webinar that CTIP sponsored with some brilliant lawyers who know this information very deeply, and that is linked on the slides for further exploration, should you choose to do so. In sum, though, direct lobbying is a communication directly with a lawmaker that reflects a view on a specific piece of legislation, while grassroots or indirect lobbying involves communicating with the public to influence lawmakers by way of calling folks to action related also to specific legislation based on a particular viewpoint. And we're talking meetings and speeches, emails, letters and tweets, among other mediums, including Targets like your US and state representatives, your city and town council members, tribal governments, and other such audiences. There certainly are nuances and restrictions beyond the IRS's test for what constitutes lobbying to pay attention to, but at its core, the rule is that lobbying activities cannot comprise a quote-unquote substantial portion of activities, and there are a couple of tests that the IRS uses to determine this, such as looking at the percentage of funds or time being allocated to activities being, say, less than 20%, but it's tough to say anything is a hard and fast rule because this is really assessed in the context of an organization's objectives, operations, and other such factors. So it's wise to consider the ways that you really can make an impact outside of this lobbying frame, and also to not be too cautious, such that no action is taken at all. And on the next slide, there are some examples of what constitutes a call to action that meets the criteria for lobbying. And some are more obvious, like prompting folks to call a particular legislator and implore them to vote yes or no on a bill, while others, like even identifying a particular legislator's position on an issue that you're speaking about and endorsing a viewpoint related to a particular piece of legislation, that constitutes lobbying. So it's good to know these things, and it's important that these fears don't paralyze participation, because it's possible that your 501c3 may actually be able to do a bit to fulfill its mission and advance its causes through advocacy without crossing that lobbying line so much as to risk tax-exempt status. A huge part of this work is to advance the conversation by elevating the trauma question, or essentially, what role the trauma and resilience and the related science play in understanding, responding to, and preventing pressing problems that exist in our communities and the larger world. That's powerful and possible across settings. And some examples of distinctions between activities that constitute education, advocacy, and lobbying are here on this slide for your reference. And again, the webinar linked a couple of slides ago goes much farther in depth for those who want to learn more about this important distinction. So with that said, we invite you to consider what motivated you to engage with this series in the first place. Did you stumble upon us through a Google search or a link sent from a friend? Did you intentionally seek out information on how to start participating in advocacy activities? Are you already doing the work and you're just curious about what other thoughts or questions you might have by taking a look at what we've compiled in this series? Maybe something else. And now that you're here with us, what are your best hopes for engaging with this series? Do you want to emerge with action steps to start a movement in your community? Do you hope to generate some ideas about what advocating for a particular issue really could look like? Do you hope to identify an issue to target in the first place? We invite you to take a moment to just think about this and keep those best hopes in mind as an anchor to inform your choices made on how you engage with this advocacy series. There are a lot of modules. Based on what you're already doing and what you hope to get out of this experience, it's likely that some of our modules will apply to you while others might not interest you or might not offer you a great deal of support in getting where you want to go. You have total choice in how you navigate this series. In terms of what you can expect in this series, here's a list of the topics we plan to cover. We fully intend this to be an ongoing series beyond these first 9 modules. And while we have some ideas for providing further support and information down the line, as mentioned before, we do want your feedback, and we invite you to let us know what would be useful to you wherever you are in the advocacy process. To conclude this first informational module, on behalf of the CTIP team, I want to express again our gratitude for all of the good work you are already doing and for continuing to inform our efforts in advancing this movement. We firmly believe that with a united network of incredible information and communities doing the real work, together we all can spur action toward meaningful, sustainable, trauma-informed change. Thanks so much, and see you in Module 2.